going to be our last day with the closed Grisaille here. So again, the goal is not to finish this whole thing. It's unlikely that you'll have the technical skill set developed yet to be able to finish this all in a 6-hour painting. So we're just going to focus on each area and build it up as we go. And see how far we can get with it. Oh, good, I do have a knife here. All right, last I left off, I needed a knife to stick in a few of these highlights, so I'm going to go ahead and get that going now. One of the things to keep in mind is that when you're going back into a painting, the first task is going to be to key in the value of what it is you're painting. So I'll pick a spot that seems relatively easy to mix back into. And then I'll be mixing the value until I think it's about right, and then I'll do a little area up here where I'll test it out and then modify as needed, and just work in one area and wipe it off and work and wipe it off until I get to the right color or value in this case, and then I'll proceed mixing from there. So we really have to be conscientious of this when we're doing it in color, because there we go, perfect. Because if you don't have the right color when you lead into it, you start to build your mixtures on top of that, then it's very likely that you're just going to end up repainting the whole thing with wrong color. So spend however long it takes, 5, 10 minutes, whatever, to get back to the color, or in this case, the value of where you last left off, because you don't want to end up having to repaint this whole thing and then lose all your brush work.
And then you key it off of that color that you mixed?
Yeah, right. This color that's on my palette here now, I know that this equals this. They're at slightly different angles toward the light, so they look slightly different on my palette as they do on the canvas, which is probably more how it's going to look like upstairs for you guys. Normally, if I was doing a painting of my own, I would have my palette completely vertical right next to it, which maybe I'll do a little later, but that way you can see exactly what it's going to look like on the canvas. Now I'm going to get some highlight in here, which is a bit lighter of a color. I'm going for that sort of highlight area right underneath the leaf there. And it actually looks like a slightly raised stroke, which has been allowed to set, and then a brush has been dragged through it just a little bit on the left-hand side to soften out that edge. I can see by the area on the right here, it looks a little raised right in here, and then here it's actually diffused with a little bit of a claw mark. So again, I'm analyzing that brush stroke and thinking what the most efficient way to do it is. There's going to be a lot of ways to do some of the stuff that we observe, but we really want to think about what might logically be the most efficient way. So I'll lay something on like that, maybe a little more here on the right side.
You're using the edge?
Yes, I'm using the edge of a palette knife in this case. And then I'll wait for this to set up a little bit. I'll splay my brush and I'll make a claw mark on the left side. It'll diffuse that left edge and get the stroke that I need for that.
Do that with a dry brush?
With a clean brush, yeah. Clean and dry brush. I don't want any medium in there because I don't want it to end up being diffused into the surrounding area.
Your cups have one medium and one thinner, is that?
Yeah, I think the one on the right was thinner, but I can't really remember. It looks very clear though, so I'm not going to dip into that. The one on the left, I believe, is the Winsor Newton painting medium. Okay. This stroke at the top here is, it looks like it could be done with the bristle brush, a small one, but it would more easily be done with a palette knife. It's very hard-edged on all sides of it. So I'm gonna shoot for a palette knife first because it's a fine shape. If this were maybe the full size of the painting, which is I think 18 by 24, I would need to, I could use a brush for it, I think. But we all know from our brushstroke charts how much more difficult it is to get an even stroke of impasto with a brush. But if you use a knife, it can become relatively simple. So see how I'm getting all the paint onto the, let's do this over here. getting all the paint scraped up to build up on the edge of my knife here like this, and then that's what I'll use to make the mark going straight across. Notice I'm not even mixing all of my colors with the knife. I'm still mixing them with the brush because, you know, overall this is a relatively thin painting. This is not super heavily impastoed paint. There's only a few areas where it's actually gotten a little bit thick. So there's no need to mix huge puddles with the palette knife in this case. Something like that. And I'll clean that up a little bit with the brush here. It's actually a little too raised, so I can knock it down just a little like that. And it's a little light. I might wait for that to set a little bit and then go over that with a slightly darker color to bring it down, because the little piece right under it should be a little lighter, this guy here. Like that. And then back to this stroke in here, I needed to get one really bright one on that center as well. So the nice thing about separating the days that you do the sort of medium layers with the impasto layers is that if something does go wrong here, I can easily scrape off the impasto layer and not mess up my painting underneath. I was doing this direct all at once in the same day, alla prima, then these strokes I do would have to be right, or else you have to strip it down and do all the layers all over again. It's a little thin on that stroke. Looks better. I need the right side of that to match the left side. It's almost like sculpting a little bit with this. And my drawing under it here wasn't quite right. You know, there should have been a little more underpainting showing through of this stroke. So I'm going to have to overpaint a little to match some of the underpainting that I see, which is the golden brown. You can see a few dark strokes in there that I'd like to hit right now. If you're finding that your values are constantly migrating towards a midtone and you're not successfully getting the light lights and the dark darks for something like this, then you may need to have a brush for your lights and a brush for your darks. That'll be a very wise decision as well when you're working in color, because as we'll find out in a couple weeks in our lecture series, the different color temperatures associated with it. And if you mix up color temperatures of the lights and the darks, then you end up getting something that looks very muddy. So we need to be very careful about that. We haven't had that problem now, and that's one of the reasons why we haven't had that lecture on color yet, but it is something that we will have to consider a little bit later on. So,
well, next week we start our limited palette.
Yep, but most likely everyone will probably be doing some sort of monochromatic underpainting first.
Right, but I mean it's...
And you'd probably
next week we start using the different sets of brushes for different...
Well, I mean your next week painting will probably look like this one here.
Right.
So
Right,
then the week after
yeah.
that, it'll end up looking, having, or requiring
Yeah.
more
The
brushes.
limited palette is the ivory black, alizarin, and yellow ochre.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or otherwise, depending on what you're painting.
Yeah, you may end up having a slightly different one, but we'll play it by ear. Yeah, I will. You know, we'll have a color lecture on Wednesday here that will teach us about selecting the appropriate set of colors for a limited palette. So that's sort of the point of Wednesday's lecture before we get into our color painting here. Some dark accents down at the bottom. The nice thing about working in black and white is you really get to focus more on the brush stroke and doing an actual painting, because if there was something wrong with the value, you know, it's really easy to just add black or white and overcome the influence of one or the other on here. But when we're in color, as we've started to see with our color charts, you know, if you have a puddle here and you add just the wrong amount of, say, alizarin, then all of a sudden your color is blown out of proportion and you have to go back and forth and back and forth, and it's not as easy to just get to the right color or value that you see. So the first step to becoming a better painter is to draw more. The second step is to do a lot of black and white paintings.
Tim, I see people pre-mix their colors sometimes. You know, I guess they analyze what they think they're going to be and just do that. Do you advise that?
You can if you want, but I will say it depends on the style of painting that you're interested in doing. If you're going to do anything that is direct...
I think it was direct painters that were doing it.
Usually you see that in indirect painters.
Oh, interesting.
You almost rarely, well, you rarely see it in direct painters, because with direct painting, a lot of times you want to use brushwork to describe all of the information and textures and things like that. So you'd want a more broken color brush stroke like we've looked at before. Otherwise, you end up having to paint a whole lot. You know, indirect painters will lay down the color for an area and then over subsequent sessions build up the information and build up the color variation. So it makes sense for them to mix large sets of puddles for general areas and then build on top of those. Whereas direct painters like to suggest as much as possible. So if we took a pre-mixed color of, say, the general blue and covered this whole pot in a general blue, you end up having to paint all this texture in, which takes a lot longer.
Yeah, they're not doing that. They're really creating 3 values of each color on their palette and then kind of working from that. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but they get their results. So. Yeah,
no, it's the same sort of idea that we're doing up here.
Yeah.
You're just making your light ranges and you already have your...
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not really any different. You have 5, in this case, 5 sets of red, yellow, and blue. Some painters will go out of their way to make strings of 10 or to just mix up big batches of the colors they see. I don't advise doing that unless you're doing a more indirect painting that you're going to build up. So there's some schools that do stuff like that. I think like the Boston Academy of Realist Art. Julie Beck, if anybody's familiar with her work, is there, and you know, they do really realistic, traditional still lifes that are somewhat indirect, and so they'll lay out their palette like that, pre-laid out. But you know, they're focusing on building it up in stages, not stroke for stroke.
Scott Christensen, who does, you know, Ala Prima or plein air and studio landscapes, was using the same grays so much that he went to Vasari Paints and has had a series of 8 of these grayish colors made up that you can buy, and he'll use those as a starting point and then tweak them as he goes along.
Yeah, you can certainly do something like that. You know, for a long time, and you know, I may recommend it depending on what palettes you end up working with. I've already suggested mixing equal proportions of your red, yellow, and blue to get a gray, because that is actually, in most instances, a better starting point for your color than starting with a pure color. Because like everything on here, except for maybe a few of the blues, is sort of a very neutral, off-neutral color. Like a dull blue or a dull white or a dull purple up there. So it makes more sense to start with something that's a gray mixed from your 3 red, yellow, and blue, and then just add a tiny bit of red, and then you've got the right color already. Things are not actually as colorful as we tend to think they are. So that's actually a really good working practice. I like it especially for you know, figure paintings that I do inside, because those are usually very, under natural light, very, very neutral. Some companies even make, you know, all the grays, like the Scott Christensen one Kathy was just talking about. I don't know if it's necessarily that you need to go out and get those, because actually a gray mixed from your 3 red, yellow, and blue will actually be a nicer gray, because it's going to fit into, you know, you're not diluting a color with more paints in there.
Are you using a lot of medium on that?
Not too much. If you look at my palette, it's just enough to get it fluid. Just enough to get it mixable and buttery, but not enough to make it drip. So just to get it to flow nicely. And not, again, not even so thin that I can see the bottom of my palette through the paint. It's still a fairly closed paint film. But when I apply it, I'll apply it in such a way where I may be utilizing the side of the brush or scrubbing it in some way to show some of the underpainting. What's that?
It just goes on so smoothly, and I always seem to be fighting my materials to get, either I'm fighting the canvas or I'm fighting the paint. Or
What do you mean by it goes on smoothly?
well, it just seems to cover so much. You know, it flows on and it covers, and you don't have to scrub it.
It allows you to make longer brush strokes.
Like a little more fluid?
Right, I mean, and it seems to allow you to load more on the brush.
It does, then straight stiff paint?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, you know, we need to get familiar with your medium of choice, and it doesn't matter which of these mediums you choose. Eventually, you know, we've done those brushstroke charts, right? And that was to show you how to handle your paint and, you know, thinner, and then one medium that you randomly selected. And now you should use that knowledge to either stick with that medium to make these marks or select a new medium that you're going to utilize. Oh, that's wrong. I'm going for that leaf in there. That was way too dark. It's okay, we just lift that off, go back to a lighter color, add a little more medium, try to deduce how thin it should be. You actually need to be a little thinner here. So at this stage of the painting, you know, I could still probably use a lean medium in this area of the painting. The other option is to just sort of lift off some of these like we do with the stain chart and show some of what's underneath so that I can still use a fatter paint if I want to, but allow some of the transparency to come through almost like a scum. And because of the tendency students have to over dilute their paint mixtures with thinner, if that tends to happen with you a lot, I may suggest something like this to achieve these brush strokes instead of thinner. You need a crisper edge at the side. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. There was a light edge at the side of that leaf. I had to figure out if it was created by underpainting, because it's almost the same value as the underpainting. I'm looking right over here at the leaf, this edge. It's a sharper edge. So I thought perhaps it was scratched in there, but I looked closer and it has a little bit of a bluish tint to it, so it's most likely the addition of white, not the underpainting.
So Tim, some of the white impasto on the reference copy looks a little scratchy. Would you scratch that in with a, I mean, at least from here, it looks a little... Like in like here? Rougher looking, yeah. Would you potentially use your palette knife to scratch some of that in?
You know what I can see from here is that that scratchiness is actually due to variation of color in there, whites and blues, which I wasn't able to get in the black and white as much. So I wouldn't try to mimic the color variation in there by scratching it on here. I'd rather, in this case, keep the paint application the same and just accept the fact that in that loaded stroke, it was not kept as full of variety as in the painting there.
So that's when they like double or triple loaded it?
It's just when the mixture wasn't mixed early. So something like this, they're mixed fairly well, but if I take a stroke that's kind of loaded like this, where I've got variation of dark and light on there, then that's going to create a stroke with a lot of different colors or values in it.
And they'll do that, some will like dip a corner red and dip a corner blue.
Yeah. So Schmidt will have some puddles like this, and then he'll drag his brush through it and just catch the edge of one of the puddles and things like that to add some variety of color in there. If the values are close enough and the color temperatures are close enough, you can actually get away with loading a lot more color into a brush stroke than you might think. So notice how, and this is like we did in drawing, I got the, I laid in the white first, got a nice crisp edge, and then I'm going back in to diffuse the edge. If we were to do this in drawing, like with an eraser, we would put that eraser in there and it would be sort of a soft edge, and then we'd have to come back in and crisp it up with the pencil. So it's kind of a reverse of that. That's pretty good there. Make sure I keep squinting as I do this. Squinting back, and since these are in the same light, I can squint back and forth, and the values should look similar. So I need to go a little lighter in here though. But at least in the area I'm working, which is great for doing these black and white master copies, because then we don't have to think as much about value. You know, if we were doing a, oh, that should have been underpainting there. If we were doing a color painting, or doing a painting in which our reference was a different lighting condition than our painting, we would have to squint at both to determine if the relationship of values on each is the same. But now, because they're under the same light, I can just squint at both together and see if they're close to the same. That's better. Let's get up into some flowers. Anybody have a preference about which flower I paint?
How about the one big one on the left?
This big one
The
over
one on the right, never mind. I don't care. I don't care.
I'll probably be able to have more of a chance of finishing the one on the right in the amount of time. That one on the left, I would probably spend a good hour or two or more concentrating on each of those brush strokes. Well, if you notice on my palette, I ended up getting a little too much medium on there, and I started to get some bubbles in there. So if you start to get bubbles in your paint, that's too much medium. Get back to more paint. If you want it thinner still, or more fluid, and you're getting bubbles in here, then instead of adding more medium, switch to a medium that is by its nature thinner or more fluid.
As opposed to stand oil.
As opposed to stand oil, right. No, that's wrong.
Is it too dark? Or?
It's too dark, yeah. See how I'm not afraid to wipe off a brush stroke? I make a mark, and then I analyze to see if it's correct. And then if it's not, I wipe it off and try again. That's what I want you guys to be doing for each of your brush strokes.
Is it okay to scrape it off with a palette knife?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I feel like you can be more precise with that when you're working a little.
Oh, you can, yeah. I usually just
Yeah.
ball up the tip of my paper towel into a little tip and swipe it off, but whatever you're more comfortable with, it doesn't matter. A paper towel that's more absorbent might take off a little bit more, but certainly whatever works for you. So there's a hard edge between the flower and the underpainting there, so I'll try and retain that. The only reason it appears a little bit softer is because the values are actually close, not because the edge is hard itself. Or I'm sorry, not because the edge is soft itself. So I want to try and retain that idea. It's hard to get into much thicker paint on the flower here, which is going to be fun. Unfortunately, my reference is blown out a little here on the lights. So we're just going to kind of have to extrapolate what some of this is, mostly by looking at the transitions and seeing if I can get close enough to determine any claw marks in the paint where it gets a little more opaque. As a general rule too, you'll notice, since I'm intending to make the white of the flower a little more opaque, I'm leading in with some paint with medium here in the slightly darker areas, and then I'll paint into the lighter areas, and then when that sets up, I'll go into the lighter areas with thicker paint and then overlap. So I'm sort of connecting the brush strokes instead of just painting one right up to the other. I'm thinking about my layering. This is really important here. Thinking about the layering. Let's go a little lighter. but I think I can still use the stroke that's up there. Nice thing about these rosemary flats is that they will, when you load them with paint, see here, they'll get to this nice chiseled edge, which will be good for some brush strokes going to the side.
Is that soft or is that bristle?
It is the Master's Choice, which is their, actually this one might be old enough to be mongoose. If not, and then it's badger. My mongoose are so old they feel like badgers.
But it's not bristle.
No, it's not bristle. If you're getting into paint thinned with medium, you should probably be staying away from the bristle brushes. It's better for paint thinned with thinner to get some of your immediate brush work, and then when you're ready to do pure body paint or impasto paint, we pull back to bring the bristles back. But for some of this stuff where we're wanting to splay it enough or have a really long flow, you'll need to use a softer brush. Now you can use a bristle for something like that if it's sufficiently old enough to where it's been washed so many times that it's become a little bit softer. We've talked about that before. So you'll just have to play it by brush. Really, you can use any brush to do anything as long as it achieves the effect you want it to achieve. Some artists, we have enough writings about what brushes they actually use, but they're usually associated with schools or their teachers or someone who had an atelier or went to an atelier and wrote a book about it. So someone like a little more obscure in the education world like Thayer, we wouldn't have, you know, what brush they used for what. It's too dark. Too dark still. All right, back to this flower here. One of the important things about alla prima, or at least direct style of painting like this that we're doing, is it's truly a focus more in brushwork and looseness, you know, saying as much as you can with as little as you can, like we've said. So if this is a style of painting that you're interested in doing, good. If this is a style of painting that you're interested in doing, then you have to pay special attention to your brushwork, whether or not it's in color or in black and white. So you have two options here if you make a correct or an incorrect brush stroke. Option one is to wipe it off and try again. Option two is to call it correct and move on to the next area. Now, given the amount of time you have to spend with a subject, if it's, say, open studio, then you may have to call certain things correct that are believable enough in their drawing as far as their shape, value, and edge, and then just move on to the next section, as opposed to wiping off and laying down the stroke and wiping off and laying down the stroke. If you have unlimited time, you can be a little more like Sargent and wipe off and lay down and wipe off and lay down for a whole week until you get it right, so that it looks like it's done very directly. But if your drawing skills and painting skills are not yet up to par, you may need to do this whole wipe off and retry and wipe off and retry. Eventually you'll get skilled enough both in your ability to lay down paint as well as your judgment of what will pass as believable, to know where you can compromise. And there are some painters that I know of personally who will let the accuracy slide quite a bit just to retain the freshness that's there, and then, you know, say that that's the painting, and, you know, accept it or don't accept it. And you can do that. I wouldn't encourage that as a student. Try to figure out a little bit of accuracy first, and then you can start dismissing it away once you become a little better at it. This rose has a lot of sharp edges in it. So flowers are deceptive like that. You know, we think of flowers, the tactile quality of them being very soft, but in reality, in a painting, they're going to have quite a bit of hard edges, and if you get them too soft, you'll end up making them look like cotton balls. And this was something we saw a lot of a few years ago at the Palette and Chisel, because there was an artist, you know, she was a great artist. She painted peonies a lot. She loved peony flowers, so she painted them all the time. And then she lost a battle with cancer. And so the Palette and Chisel ended up going crazy where we started painting peonies for her. People who had not painted them before, you know, they're already a cotton ball-y looking type of flower. And so if you haven't painted them before and you're not used to painting flowers and you think they're all these soft edges, then when you paint them, they end up just looking like giant cotton balls in a vase. And that's what a lot of the paintings ended up looking like. And roses tend to be the same way as well. So you have to be pretty careful when you're painting them and pay special attention to the edges. Again, each time I decide on a stroke, especially here when I'm transitioning between the light and the dark, I'm asking myself, was one paint just pulled into the other, or was there an intermediary stroke painted to connect them? Because that's, you know, that's the two main ways we're going to see to soften edges here. Either we physically soften them, like if we took a stump and stumped them out, or there's been strokes laid down, like if we were veiling and filling in and evening everything out with the pencil. And when there's a lot of color, you know, this is very low chroma, so I wouldn't have to worry too much about this, especially in black and white, because if you end up mixing two values, then you can always go back and it's really easy to fix. In color though, if this was really chromatic, especially in a flower, if we had, you know, bright whitish color here and a bluish color or something for the shadow, and they were really brilliant, and I just soften those together, then it's immediately going to destroy their brilliance. Like we saw with the broken color class, you know, it's exactly the same thing. So we have to start thinking now, as we're observing these paintings, about how these transitions were achieved. And certainly today, if you have a question, call me over and I will be more than willing to look at your reference and try and help you figure out how it was done. I'll try to lead you to the correct answer first without telling you, but we eventually need to get you to the point where you can figure that out in the painting, because then you have to start figuring it out for yourself. And it's always harder to figure it out for yourself than look at the work of someone else. I'm getting into much less medium now, more pure paint. Notice I'm still sticking to a rather large brush. The beauty of these flats is that they can be held at angles where I can get very small marks or very large marks.
And you want more full body and or impasto, which is why you're not using medium?
Yes, yeah. Oh, it's too late. So if I decide to leave it up there instead of wiping off the stroke, it's because I've analyzed the area and decided that the stroke wasn't a single bold mark made. It was probably a collection of marks, in which case I can add to that. If it was obviously just a one stroke sort of thing and I got it wrong, I would lift it off and try it again. And the nice thing about kind of the academic method of painting, like with the Freon copy some of you are doing, and with the Alma-Tadema copy some of you guys are doing, you know, that's a more academic method, so there's not as much the, oh, the stroke isn't quite perfect, I'm going to scrape it off and try again. It's the build it up, build it up, build it up, build it up, and at the end of the day scrape it down and then try again next time. until you get it right. So it's a little more comfortable to work that way. And interestingly enough, that's how I see people working in open studios all the time. The problem is all those people in open studios really like the alla prima direct sort of thing. So they're working in a process that's not conducive to creating the paintings they want to make. And that's totally fine, but then everyone says, oh, I don't have the patience to paint like an academic painter. Well, you are painting like an academic painter. You're just doing the lay-in stage, the block-in.
Well, there isn't really enough time in open studio to do.
No, there's not, to do a truly academic painting.
Yeah.
No. And a lot of the schools will still do shorter open studios like that more academic schools, just because it gives you practice in the foundation of a painting, the laying in, because the better that is, the less work you have to do later on. So all those schools who do super long paintings still do 3-hour paintings and 5-hour paintings. They're just not, they wouldn't ever call those their finished paintings, they would call those studies.
So would you suggest that in open studio, rather than trying to do the whole face or the whole figure, we just pick apart?
Absolutely.
One section and
Absolutely, yeah. The goal is, especially if you're trying to learn, again, the goal is not to fill everything up. The goal is to do everything correctly. So spend the time to learn how to do one thing right. If you're in open studio doing portrait, spend the whole time painting the eyes. And then when you're able to do that in 3 hours with no problem because you've done it so much, then spend a bunch of time doing the eyes and the nose. And then when you get good at that, go down to the mouth, etc., etc. That's what Schmidt had everyone do at the Palette and Chisel when they were there. And I think Rose was saying when she was in town last, like, oh yeah, we go in and Schmidt would say, okay, well for a month we're just painting nose, everybody. Let's all paint noses. And all the kids would be like, yeah, let's just do noses. And so they got good at painting noses. And that's how you get good. You go slow and observe a lot. Not try to fill everything in.
Well, it's good enough for Leonardo, it should be good enough for others.
That's right. Go a little lighter here. Yeah, for Open Studio, the best thing I can say is just don't be intimidated by the other artists that are there. Because there will be some artists who come in and by the end of the first 45 minutes it looks like their painting is done. And so that sort of inspires everyone else to work in that same way. But if you don't have the 20 or 30 years of practice building up to that, then it's unreasonable to assume you'd be able to replicate it. Dark needs to be a little lighter in here. That's too dark. Sometimes I'll mix and mix and mix and mix and mix, and then I'll go up to lay the stroke and then say, oh, when I put my brush up there, it's not quite right, and then I'll mix some more. Don't be afraid to do that. Some of the best painters I know spend the majority of their time mixing. It's a thinking game. Trying to think of what we're going to do next. How we're going to lay on top. How we're going to set up the next stages of our painting. Crisper edge right around the corner here. And then a little more transparent down here. I need to get some of the dark behind the rose here as well. Because that'll allow me to have some sharper edges where they're greatly needed. again, even though I'm painting the flower and I have to paint in some background to help give the flower context, I'm still going to observe the background and think carefully about how thick I want it, what's the right value, what's the edge quality, all of that, even for a background element. Some people just like scrub in a background and then like, okay, now I'm going to work on the object I'm thinking of or wanting to paint, but you need to make sure you give everything its due thought. You can see I didn't even put that flower in the right spot. Oh well. Crisper edge there. So the pot actually goes out to here. At this stage in the game, we're going to leave it as it is here.
That's when you say, I meant to do that.
Yeah, right. You'll never hear me say that in a demo. I hate when artists do that. Like it's really wrong to make a mistake. So it's always, oh, I meant to do that. I meant to make them look 10 years older. Well, sharp edge back there. To get some sharper edges in here. Got a little hair sticking out. It's ruining my sharp edge. In fact, I need to get a really sharp edge, and that is, the brush is a little too serrated, so I'm going to go into a more detailed brush here. Just because this edge has to be a little crisper. There we go, like that. Now again, for your master copy at home, you'll be able to get away with more drawing errors like this one here, if it's a landscape or a still life. But if it's a face, you can't turn it in with like the nose an inch or two to the left or something. You know, it has to look like a believable face. Again, we're going off the rules of believability here. And I would encourage you to spend a little more time drawing this out at home than we were allowed to do here in class, because we just have to fly right through it. But there is nothing stopping you from doing a full drawing at home and then transferring the drawing. For something really precise, that's usually what I will do.
So for our,
I might do that.
our home project, you want the whole thing, not just a portion of it.
Correct.
Trace it.
If we find something we really like, does it have to be the same proportion or the same measurements as the painting, or could it be just a proportional?
Yeah, you can reduce it down as long as you still get the same character of brushwork.
So basically, say you're trying to do this. Even, okay, that's your page.
Just trying to mix a transitionary color here.
You just trace this, and you flip your tracing paper, and you outline it a little up. And then you turn it back over on your canvas, and then sure.
You might want to have a separate piece of paper than you charcoal. You might want to have a separate piece of paper than you charcoal, so you retain your drawing.
We're getting pretty close on this flower here.
Sometimes it doesn't clean enough, so I think it might.
The nice thing too about doing a drawing ahead of time is that if your painting doesn't turn out well, you can always use that. If there's not an issue with the drawing, you can always use that drawing and start again. So you don't have to end up redrawing and redrawing, especially if you're doing a figure or a portrait. You know, you spend all that time to get the subtlety in there. You don't want to have to do it all again just because you messed up on the paint brush stroke part.
If you have it on tracing paper, you can use that to check your work as you go along.
Yeah, to make sure you haven't lost your drawing in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty close on him. anyone have any questions here?
To me, that top pedal has a sharper edge on the end.
Over here?
No, other side.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Hopefully I'll get to him.
okay.
Yeah, hopefully. Let's see.
Would you normally, would it help to do darks first, like the leaf at the bottom of that rose is so dark, would it help to put that in and then put the,
Sometimes. So, and it just depends on you. In this case, it looks like it was put after because it was painted up close to but not into the flower. So the flower, I can see gaps of underpainting between the leaf and the flower. So I know that they weren't layered. Yeah, it's completely up to you. You just have to make sure that you give yourself enough setup time if you're going to do that. So for example, when I first laid this stroke in here, they weren't set up enough and both strokes were fluid, so they just blended into each other. And I needed slightly sharper edges. I laid that in.
Which of those? What strokes?
These two up here. And even though I'm going to modify the value, you know, right now, to address your question too, Pam, the edge is actually correct. It's just the value between them is not correct. So it appears that mine is softer because the values are closer together.
Yeah,
So-
it's not really the top edge, it's that right side edge where it
Oh, over in
curves
here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the one.
he's not even painted yet.
Yeah, that's the
But,
one I keep looking at.
both of those will need to get addressed. Actually, all the way around will. But yeah, I'll do that by painting the background under it. Let's see. Need a little more paint. You'll notice again from your brush stroke charts, it's really difficult to get a crisp edge if your paint is too thinned out or fluid. You'll need to make sure it's a little stiffer or buttery, more buttery to get that crisper edge. Otherwise, you'll just fight a losing battle here on canvas. It's a little more. That's a little better there. So with this assignment too, you're just learning how to layer really all these brush strokes on top of each other. And if you're not successful, it's not as huge of a deal because you're just mixing black and white. Like something I'm doing now. And in some cases, if it's not laid quite exactly correctly on top of it, then some of that color underneath shows through, which isn't a huge deal here because it's just black and white. If this were in color though, you know, we have to be really careful to make sure that all of this is very gingerly placed on. Otherwise, our flowers are going to look really muddy. Especially if you're going to layer on the lights on top of the darks. You definitely don't want those darks to be showing through on the lights. It's actually a little easier at this stage too to layer on paint if I don't have medium in it. If I thin it out too much, it won't sit on top of the layers under it. It'll just sort of mix and splay everything out. A little too dark there. All right, I think we have
It's 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. All right, let me throw in the last couple strokes for this side. We'll try and paint it nice and bold. And then we're setting you guys loose here. Squinting down to try and get the right value. I have enough medium in here where I can just keep pushing that paint right up to the side of the petal. And then we'll lay on some thick guys on top here. Still not thick enough, or hard enough on that edge.
I don't know. Do you think it's harder to paint in some ways from master copy because you are trying to replicate? I'm not saying you don't learn from doing it, but if you're painting something you see, you may not see all the subtlety, which is too bad, but
Yeah.
you wouldn't be.
So your question is it harder to do this than to paint from?
In some ways, I mean, you're studying so much more, I think, than you would from life. I don't know, maybe not.
Well, in this case, we're not studying the objects that we're painting. We're studying
Brushstrokes.
painting making itself. So it's a different type of study.
Yeah.
So in that respects, it might be harder because it's forcing you to think about some of the stuff which you should be thinking about when you're doing a normal painting. So if it is harder to do a master copy than painting from life, then you're probably not thinking about your painting from life enough when you're doing it there. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same as with this academic method of drawing. You know, it points out your weakness in drawing because we don't have as much of the flair sort of stuff when we're doing an academic drawing. Everything's supposed to be built up very slowly and process oriented so you can spot errors immediately as they occur. So some people say that that's harder. Well, it's not really harder, it's just you can see your errors more easily. So some people don't like it because of that. Okay, we can stop there and we'll get you guys upstairs painting.
I have a question, Tim. The
Go ahead.
rose is beautiful. Is the center of the pot now need to be lighter?
Oh, you know what? I didn't finish my impasto strokes in the middle last week, but yeah, like in here it needs to come up a bit.
Where before it seemed to match this.
No, it didn't match before, but it I couldn't lay them on last week just because it was so thick and wet there. And then stroke or two in here. Oh, that's too light.
I'm speeding now.
You over here. Oops. All right. So yeah, if you don't have any questions, you can head on up and get started.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
I'm counting
Professor, you guys are both doing this, right?
Yeah, counting the words, everything got that easier. I know, I'm watching you, but you way ahead of me.
You know, that,
Yeah, in my mind, really?
in your own judgment, now you're seeing.
Right, so much more, which is great, but. Okay.
Oh, you know what? I forgot to do this guy.
Yeah.
I need to do this one. So.
I don't know. Oh, I missed getting my
Yeah.
studio done.